So the end of the year is a time of great celebration for many people, but also brings a lot of stress for some of us. But be it rather overspending, matric results that are due early in the new year, and even unemployment, which is a struggle for many graduates who are hoping to go into the job market in 2020. Let's talk about some of these worries now and how we can at least try to cope with them. To have that conversation, I'm joined by Zolani Metu, a psychologist and former Fees Must Fall activist, who's currently the founder and CEO of Decolonial Mental Health. Zolani, a very good evening to you. Thank you for coming in. So we are at the end of the year. A lot of us fatigued, as happens at the end of every year. People also trying to plan a lot about what they're going to take into the new year. Is this the best time to be dealing with that sort of thing?
First of all, thanks a lot for having me, and a good evening to you and your viewers. I think as we go into this conversation, I really want to precede it with saying I think South Africans are well within their right to celebrate the festive season, given our victories this year. But I definitely do think that December, puts people in a very specific position where very often finances become tight, stress levels are quite high, be it, anticipations of what come in the next year, or stresses about what's happened in the course of the year. So generally, this is a month where people tend to reflect, but I definitely do think it also is a month where people are presented with an opportunity, right? You either reflect from an optimistic point of view to see what could lie ahead, or also you could be looking at all the bad things that have happened.
And a lot of the issues that people deal with, I was listing unemployment, I was listing issues around matric results, for example, people who are dealing with workplace fatigue. But compounding that for some are issues of loneliness as well. So how do I begin to declutter while addressing every layer of the problem?
I think the one thing we need to say as we go on as well is that most of these isms that you're putting on the table are only microcosms of bigger issues, right? I think South Africa inherited a system where the predominantly black population was disenfranchised by our history of colonialism and apartheid, and these are realities that people are perpetually living with. So, for example, if we're looking at the issue of unemployment, you find that, depression is much more prevalent amongst young people. What does that really mean when you're dealing with a society where people don't necessarily have access to mental health care, and even when they do have access to mental health care, it's an alienating experience because perhaps they can't relate to the white psychologist, or just the psychotherapeutic induction is not something through which they can see themselves. So I think then the conversation should be around how do we address these things from a systematic perspective instead of locating the pathology within individuals. So if we're dealing with issues around gender-based violence, which also becomes much more prevalent in the December season, or we're looking at issues of unemployment, because young people are now realizing that 2020 is another year, and some people are sitting with uncertainties. Do I get a job? Do I not get a job? What does this really look like? So these are all the mental, it's a mental health magnetic field that we're dealing with, but very often we're saying black people don't go to therapy when they're dealing with issues, and I think that really locates pathology within the black population, and I don't think that's fair.
But we've got now the likes of the South African Depression and Anxiety groups. I beg your pardon, there are also a lot of other smaller organizations that are trying to work in this space. Are people making use of those services?
I think generally people do make use of the services. I think where we are now really is negotiating a situation around we've tried to give access to mental health care, and I need to say this quite carefully because I don't think we're quite there yet, even with regards to access. But generally, when it comes to toll-free lines, all those things, they are there, and people can try and make calls. But in general, very few people report a positive experience from those telephonic conversations. I definitely do think that there's value in having them, but I do think as a nation, we need to relook how we see mental health care, but also how we see psychosocial well-being as a society. Because, for example, one of the things that we're dealing with is a system where wellness ideology is still pervaded by white psychiatric thinking. What that looks like is a situation where we're much more preoccupied is a situation where we're much more preoccupied with managing clinical symptoms amongst people who've been diagnosed with mental illnesses, but there are people who need the psychosocial support and don't often get it. And so I think that's where, you know, especially in December, we should be focusing on, at least in the lens of parents, communities, and other interested stakeholders.
You throw in alcohol, great for a party where everyone knows how to handle themselves and their limit, but it also, as you were highlighting, for example, with gender-based violence, can be a very toxic ingredient in all of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, if you look at even, you know, statistics around crime and violence in South Africa, you'll find that the majority of, you know, criminal activities have been associated with alcohol use, and also you find that alcohol and cannabis use are the most common substances that are used in South Africa.
But they're also a coping mechanism for a great many people.
Definitely. No, definitely. Most people resort to that as a way to cope with their reality. But then research tells us that you might be able to, you know, feel some relief of certain ills in the short term, but in the longer term, it's not really helpful.
Family, you spoke about this. A lot of people dread going home. I mean, you look at social media, you find a lot of threads now or tweets where people say, I am unable to go home because if I do go home, it's going to be a miserable experience. From comments about weight, why aren't you married yet? Why don't you have kids? Are you gay? Are you straight? What's going on? How do people prepare to go into that environment? Is the best option to ignore it altogether?
I don't think ignorance really solves anything ever. I think, you know, the issue of family is much more important, especially when we're talking about people's mental health and well-being. So, for example, you mentioned the issue of, you know, sexual orientation and sexuality and how that makes it difficult for people. Say, for example, you're at RES and at university. We understand that South African universities are generally a better space where people can find, you know, true expressions of their identities. But people are often conflicted when it's time to go home. You also find with women, if you're living in RES and Rondebosch at UCT, time to go back to Gugulethu where, you know, patriarchy thrives, chauvinism thrives. And so that's a reality that most people are dealing with. But I think one of the best ways, I would say, for people to be able to live with these realities is for families themselves and for communities as well to come to the table to say, let's have a conversation around all these social ills that we hear. Because I think right now, you and I in Hyde Park, we're having the conversation, but very often these conversations are left in these golden...
Let me ask you then about how you start that conversation in what is often already such a hostile environment where attitudes have built over decades.
And I think so that conversation also comes with, you know, the mental health dialogue. How do you talk about anxiety and depression at home? So very often when I do work with Decolonial mental health, I'll start by saying, what is mental illness in your home language? And I've found that people across races, you find African students, everyone's struggling with that. And I think the same applies to conversation around gender-based violence, etc. Let's move beyond this philosophical dialogue that we often have within our spaces and see how we can introduce the conversation from a perspective that people can understand. But also I think there's a risk with that in that you often place the responsibility on people who are victimized by these realities. So it has to be a two-way. I could come and say, here's the method, but for as long as other people aren't willing to come into the table, then it becomes a one-way street, really.
Zolani, thank you so much for your time. That was Zolani Metu speaking to us there about how to, at some level at least, try to prepare ourselves mentally for the many stresses that people deal with at the end of the year and indeed heading into the new year 2020.